In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean during World War II, where steel titans clashed beneath tropical skies and the fate of nations hung in the balance, one modest destroyer escort would accomplish what no other warship in naval history had achieved before or since. This is the extraordinary tale of the USS England, a vessel that in just 12 days would sink 6 enemy submarines, establishing a record so remarkable that it remains unmatched to this day. Between May 19th and May 31st, 1944, this single American warship would systematically hunt down and destroy an entire line of Japanese submarines, changing the course of naval warfare and demonstrating the deadly effectiveness of new anti-submarine technology. The story of USS England is not merely a tale of technological superiority or tactical brilliance, but a profound testament to the convergence of human courage, intelligence breakthrough, and innovation under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The story begins not with thunderous guns or dramatic sea battles, but in the quiet, methodical work of American codebreakers operating from a nondescript building in Pearl Harbor. On May 13, 1944, the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, known as FRUPAC, and the successor to the legendary Commander Joseph Rochefort's Station Hypo, intercepted a routine Japanese radio transmission. The message, sent from the submarine I-16 to the commander of Japanese Submarine Division 7, contained what seemed like mundane operational details: an estimated time of arrival off Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, scheduled for 2200 hours on May 22nd. But to the trained eyes of American intelligence officers, this intercepted message represented something far more valuable: an opportunity to strike at the heart of Japan's underwater fleet. The intelligence operation that made England's success possible had its roots in years of painstaking work by American cryptanalysts. Since the early days of the war, teams of mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers had labored in secrecy to break Japanese naval codes. Their work, conducted in windowless rooms filled with IBM tabulating machines and mountains of paper, had already contributed to American victories at Midway and in the Solomon Islands. But never before had decoded intelligence been used so directly and effectively in anti-submarine warfare. The process of breaking the Japanese naval code JN-25 required not just mathematical brilliance, but also deep cultural understanding and linguistic expertise. Each message had to be intercepted, recorded, analyzed for patterns, and painstakingly decoded using techniques that combined mechanical computation with human intuition. The decoded intelligence was immediately transmitted through secure channels to the Third Fleet, and from there to Commander Hamilton Haines, who commanded Escort Division 39 stationed at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Haines was a veteran destroyer commander who had seen action in the Atlantic before being transferred to the Pacific. His experience hunting German U-boats would prove invaluable in the coming engagement. Haines wasted no time in organizing a response. He ordered the formation of a 3-ship hunter-killer task group, selecting the best anti-submarine vessels available for this critical mission. The group would consist of 3 Buckley-class destroyer escorts: USS George, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Fred W. Just; Raby, DE-698, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Scott; and USS England, DE-635, led by Lieutenant Commander Walton Barclay Pendleton. England was temporarily detached from Escort Division 40 at Purvis Bay on Florida Island to join this urgent mission. All 3 ships departed Purvis Bay on May 18, 1944, with Commander Haines embarked aboard George as the officer in tactical command. The selection of these 3 ships was no accident. Each had been specifically equipped and trained for anti-submarine warfare, and their crews had spent months perfecting their skills in the dangerous waters around the Solomon Islands. The ships had worked together before, developing the teamwork and communication protocols that would prove essential in the coordinated attacks to come. Their crews, though young and relatively inexperienced in combat, had been drilled relentlessly in sonar operation, attack procedures, and damage control. This preparation would soon pay dividends beyond anyone's imagination. But this submarine hunt was part of a much larger strategic picture unfolding across the Pacific. That same day, the task force departed. Additional radio intelligence revealed a disturbing development. The Japanese were establishing a scouting line of 7 submarines, designated the NA Line, stretching between the Admiralty Islands north of New Guinea and Truk in the Caroline Islands. This submarine picket line was positioned directly across the route that American carriers were expected to use in their next major operation. The Japanese High Command was anticipating new Allied landings, but remained uncertain about the target. Would it be the Marianas, the Western Caroline Islands, or the western end of New Guinea? The strategic thinking behind the Japanese submarine deployment reflected the desperate situation facing the Imperial Navy in mid-1944. With their carrier force decimated and their island bases increasingly isolated, submarines represented one of the few remaining tools for gathering intelligence and potentially disrupting American operations. The NA Line was conceived as an early warning system that would give the Japanese fleet time to respond to American moves. Each submarine was assigned a specific patrol area, with orders to remain on station and report any American naval movements. The rigid nature of these assignments, so different from the flexible patrol areas used by American submarines, would prove to be a fatal flaw in the Japanese plan. The Japanese strategic planners, analyzing recent American carrier strikes supporting General Douglas MacArthur's westward advance along New Guinea's northern coast, concluded that Western New Guinea was the most likely target. In response, the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Somu Toyoda, issued orders for Operation A-Go, intended to be the decisive naval battle that would halt the American advance and protect Japan's inner defense perimeter, encompassing the Marianas, Western Caroline Islands, and Western New Guinea. The execution of this plan would ultimately lead to catastrophic Japanese defeats in what history would remember as the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Marianas Turkey Shoot, where Japan would lose 3 aircraft carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and aircraft in June 1944. The planning for Operation A-Go revealed the fundamental weaknesses in Japanese naval strategy by 1944. The loss of experienced pilots at Midway, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz had never been fully replaced. The new pilots being rushed through abbreviated training programs lacked the skills of their predecessors. Meanwhile, American pilot training had become a massive industrial enterprise, producing thousands of highly trained aviators. The technological gap was widening too. American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat significantly outperformed their Japanese counterparts, and American ships bristled with radar-directed anti-aircraft guns that made attacking them increasingly suicidal. To support Operation A-Go, Vice Admiral Takagi Takeo, commander of the Japanese 6th Fleet, submarines, directed submarines from the 7th Submarine Squadron to establish the NA scouting line. Takagi was a veteran submarine commander who had witnessed the steady deterioration of Japan's underwater fleet. At the war's start, Japanese submarines had been among the best in the world, with highly trained crews and excellent torpedoes. But losses had been heavy, and replacement crews lacked the skill and experience of their predecessors. Moreover, Japanese submarine doctrine, which emphasized attacks on warships rather than merchant vessels, had proven strategically flawed. While American submarines were strangling Japan's supply lines, Japanese submarines were being hunted to extinction, with little to show for their sacrifice. In a decision that would prove fatal, 7 Japanese submarines were assigned to specific fixed positions along this line, rather than being given flexible operating areas as American submarines typically were. This rigid positioning would become a critical vulnerability. The chain of events that would doom these submarines began when Japanese forces intercepted an American aircraft's contact report on submarine RO-104. In response, the Japanese promptly radioed orders to the entire NA line to shift their positions 60 nautical miles to the southeast, transmitting specific coordinates for each submarine's new position. This seemingly routine operational message was intercepted by American radio intelligence and immediately forwarded to the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean area, where cryptanalysts worked feverishly to break out the coordinates. The process was complex and required not just breaking the code, but understanding the Japanese Navy's coordinate system and operational procedures. Though the process was complex and required careful analysis, the American codebreakers successfully extracted the precise positions of each submarine in the NA line. For the first time in the Pacific War, this ultra-secret intelligence would be sanitized and shared directly with anti-submarine forces, giving them an unprecedented advantage in hunting enemy submarines. The intelligence proved remarkably accurate. In each case, the Japanese submarines would be found within 50 nautical miles, and often much closer, to exactly where the decoded messages indicated they would be. The decision to share this intelligence with tactical units represented a significant risk. If the Japanese realized their codes were compromised, they might change them, depriving the Allies of a crucial advantage. Elaborate precautions were taken to disguise the source of the intelligence. Cover stories were prepared attributing the submarine discoveries to aerial reconnaissance or routine patrols. The crews of the destroyer escorts were told they were acting on aerial sighting reports, never knowing that their success was enabled by one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. The 3 destroyer escorts of the hunter-killer group were all relatively new Buckley-class vessels, part of a massive wartime construction program that would eventually produce 154 of these specialized anti-submarine warships, with 148 completed and some serving with the British Royal Navy under Lend-Lease. The Buckley-class represented a compromise between capability and mass production. Smaller and less expensive than fleet destroyers, they could be built quickly in commercial shipyards by workers with limited experience. Yet they packed enough firepower and anti-submarine equipment to be deadly submarine hunters. Their diesel-electric propulsion system, while limiting their top speed, gave them exceptional range and the ability to operate for extended periods without refueling. Each ship had been named to honor a fallen hero, carrying forward the legacy of American servicemen who had made the ultimate sacrifice. This naming tradition served not just to honor the dead, but to inspire the living. The crews of these ships knew they sailed under the names of heroes, and this knowledge instilled a sense of duty and determination that went beyond normal military obligation. USS George bore the name of Seaman Second Class Eugene F. George, who had been posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his heroic actions as an anti-aircraft gunner aboard the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco during the brutal naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 12, 1942. The battle off Guadalcanal had been one of the most savage surface engagements of the war, fought at point-blank range in the darkness with ships firing at each other based on muzzle flashes and shadowy silhouettes. When a damaged Japanese G-4M Betty bomber, already aflame from San Francisco's anti-aircraft fire, deliberately aimed for the cruiser's gun positions in a suicide attack, Seaman George and his fellow gunners stood their ground, continuing to fire at the approaching aircraft until the very moment of impact. The bomber crashed into San Francisco's bridge structure, killing Admiral Daniel Callahan and his staff, but George and his gun crew never wavered. George and several other San Francisco gunners who died at their posts that day were awarded the Navy Cross, and ships were named in their honor. USS Raby was named for Rear Admiral James Joseph Raby, who had earned the Navy Cross during World War I while commanding transatlantic convoy operations, including the very first convoy to cross the Atlantic under American escort. Raby had been a pioneer in anti-submarine warfare during the First World War, developing many of the tactics and procedures that were still in use. His experience had proven that convoys, properly escorted, could defeat the submarine menace. Tragically, Admiral Raby was killed in an automobile accident in 1934 while serving as commandant of the Charleston Naval District, but his legacy of protecting merchant shipping would live on through the vessel that bore his name. USS England carried perhaps the most poignant history of all. She was named for Ensign John Charles England, a young naval officer who had been killed during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. England, just 4 days shy of his 21st birthday, had volunteered to work in USS Oklahoma's radio room that fateful morning, trading shifts with a friend so the other man could spend more time with his family when they arrived in Hawaii. England himself was eagerly awaiting the arrival of his wife and 3-week-old daughter, whom he had never seen. When Japanese torpedoes struck the battleship and she began to capsize, Ensign England initially escaped to the deck. The scene that greeted him was one of unimaginable chaos. Oklahoma was rolling over, trapping hundreds of men inside her hull. Oil-covered sailors were struggling in the water, some on fire, while Japanese aircraft strafed survivors. But remembering the men still trapped in the radio room below, England made a fateful decision. He returned to the sinking ship's interior. 3 times he descended into the capsizing battleship, each time successfully guiding a trapped sailor to safety through passages that were rapidly filling with water and oil. The ship's electrical system had failed, plunging the interior into darkness. England had to navigate by touch and memory, fighting against rushing water and the ship's increasing list. On his 4th attempt to rescue his shipmates, Ensign England disappeared into the Oklahoma's flooding compartments and was never seen again. He was one of 429 officers and men who perished aboard Oklahoma that day. The tragedy of USS Oklahoma was one of the most horrific of Pearl Harbor. As the ship capsized, hundreds of men were trapped in air pockets within her hull. For days after the attack, salvage workers could hear tapping from inside the ship as trapped sailors signaled for help. Heroic efforts were made to cut through the hull and rescue survivors, and 32 men were eventually saved. But for most, including Ensign England, there would be no rescue. Initially buried among the unknown casualties at Punchbowl National Cemetery in Hawaii, Ensign England's remains would not be identified until 2016, when advances in DNA technology finally allowed him to be returned home to Colorado Springs, where he was reburied next to his parents. Though he received only a Purple Heart for his sacrifice, his extraordinary heroism in repeatedly risking and ultimately giving his life to save others would be commemorated through not 1 but 2 warships bearing his name, DE-635 and the later guided missile cruiser CG-22. The Buckley-class destroyer escorts were purpose-built submarine hunters, armed with 3 3-inch guns for surface action but optimized for anti-submarine warfare. Their main battery, while adequate for defense against aircraft and surface craft, was deliberately kept light to save weight and cost. The real striking power of these ships lay in their anti-submarine armament. Their arsenal included 1 triple bank of 21-inch torpedoes, 2 stern-mounted depth-charge racks, 8 K-gun depth-charge projectors that could hurl charges to either side of the ship, and most importantly, 1 Mark 10 Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar. It was this last weapon that would prove decisive in the coming battles. The development of specialized anti-submarine vessels like the Buckley-class reflected hard-learned lessons from the Battle of the Atlantic. There, German U-boats had come perilously close to severing Britain's lifelines. The Allies had learned that defeating submarines required not just weapons, but also specialized platforms optimized for the task. These ships needed long range to escort convoys across vast ocean distances, good seakeeping abilities to operate in rough weather, and sophisticated detection equipment to find submerged submarines. The Buckley-class incorporated all these requirements in a package that could be mass-produced in American shipyards. The Hedgehog represented a revolution in anti-submarine warfare, addressing fundamental flaws that had plagued submarine hunters since World War I. Developed by the British Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development in 1941 and first deployed in 1942, the Hedgehog had only recently become widely available to American forces in late 1943. The weapons development had been driven by desperate necessity during Britain's darkest hours, when U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. The weapon consisted of 24 projectiles arranged in 6 rows of 4, mounted on a trainable platform that could fire them in an elliptical pattern, 200 to 300 yards ahead of the attacking ship. Each projectile weighed 65 pounds, with a 35-pound charge of TNT or Torpex explosive. The projectiles would be fired in a carefully timed sequence so that all 24 would impact the water simultaneously, creating a deadly pattern approximately 140 feet by 120 feet in area. The name Hedgehog came from the weapon's appearance when loaded. The spigot mortars protruding from the launcher resembled the spines of the small mammal. But there was nothing small about the weapon's impact on naval warfare. It represented a fundamental shift in how surface ships attacked submarines, solving problems that had bedeviled naval tacticians for decades. What made the Hedgehog revolutionary was its contact-fused warheads. Unlike traditional depth charges, which detonated at preset depths using hydrostatic fuses regardless of whether they were near a submarine, each Hedgehog projectile would only explode on direct contact with a solid object. This fundamental difference provided several crucial advantages that would prove decisive in the battles ahead. First, the success or failure of an attack was immediately apparent. If one or more projectiles hit a submarine, there would be explosions. If all missed, there would be silence. Ship commanders no longer had to wait 20 minutes or more, scanning the surface for oil or debris to determine if their attack had succeeded. The Hedgehog could be reloaded in approximately 3 minutes, allowing for rapid follow-up attacks if the first salvo missed. This quick reload time was critical. Submarines that survived the first attack often escaped during the long reload times required for traditional depth charge attacks. Second, and perhaps most importantly, the Hedgehog solved the problem of sonar blindness that had long plagued anti-submarine forces. Traditional depth charges created massive underwater explosions whether they hit their target or not, and these detonations would deafen the attacking ship's sonar for many minutes, creating sound disturbances that could take up to 15 minutes to dissipate. During this period of acoustic blindness, submarines could often escape undetected. The concussion from depth charges also created a barrier of turbulent water and air bubbles that reflected sonar pulses, making tracking impossible. With the Hedgehog, if the projectiles missed, there were no explosions to disturb the water, allowing the attacking ship to maintain continuous sonar contact and immediately set up for another attack. The psychological dynamics were also different. While depth charges created a terrifying barrage of explosions that could damage submarine morale even when they missed, potentially forcing submarines to surface or surrender, the Hedgehog was a silent killer. Submarines had no warning that an attack was underway until the projectiles were already in the water, taking about 7 seconds to sink to 200 feet. This gave submarine commanders no time to take evasive action. With traditional stern-dropped depth charges, experienced submarine captains could calculate when they entered the attacking ship's minimum sonar detection range and execute sharp evasive maneuvers to avoid the charges being rolled off the stern. Some submarine commanders had become so skilled at this that they could predict almost exactly when depth charges would explode and maneuver accordingly. The Hedgehog eliminated this tactical option entirely. Statistics from the war would later prove the Hedgehog's devastating effectiveness. British analysis showed that during World War II, an average of 60 traditional depth charge attacks were required to sink one submarine. In the early war period, this ratio was even worse, sometimes over 100 attacks per kill. With the Hedgehog, this ratio improved dramatically to approximately 1 submarine sunk for every 5 to 6 attacks, a 10-fold improvement in lethality. Although each Hedgehog projectile carried less explosive power than a standard depth charge, a direct hit from even a single projectile was usually sufficient to breach a submarine's pressure hull and send it to the bottom. The contact explosion against the hull was far more destructive than the pressure wave from a near-miss depth charge explosion, as the hull itself helped contain and focus the explosive force inward. The submarine I-16 that had triggered this hunt was no ordinary vessel but a veteran of 9 war patrols with a distinguished if ultimately tragic combat record. A Type C-1 submarine, one of the largest in the Japanese fleet, I-16 was 358 feet long and displaced 3,561 tons submerged. She was specially equipped to carry a Type A midget submarine mounted on her deck, and it was I-16 that had achieved a unique place in history by launching the very first midget submarine attack of the Pacific War. The story of I-16's role at Pearl Harbor illustrated both the innovation and the ultimate futility of Japanese naval special operations. The midget submarine program had been developed in great secrecy, with the tiny two-man craft intended to penetrate enemy harbors and deliver devastating torpedo attacks. 5 mother submarines, including RM-16, had carried midget submarines to Pearl Harbor, launching them in the pre-dawn hours of December 7, 1941. Under the command of Lieutenant Junior Grade Yokoyama Masaharu, I-16's midget submarine had been launched at 0042, several hours before the Pearl Harbor air attack, attempting to penetrate the harbor defenses and attack American warships from within. The fate of these midget submarines revealed the gap between Japanese ambition and reality. Though Yokoyama's craft never returned and his fate remained unknown, I-16 received radio transmissions believed to be from his midget on the afternoon of December 7th reporting a successful attack, and another early on December 8th indicating the craft could not navigate. Post-war analysis suggested that none of the midget submarines successfully attacked American ships at Pearl Harbor. One was sunk by the destroyer USS Ward in the war's opening shots. Another was destroyed inside the harbor by USS Monaghan. One ran aground, and its sole survivor became America's first Japanese prisoner of war, and 2 simply vanished. None of the 5 midget submarines launched that day returned to their motherships, and of the 10 crewmen, only 1 survived the war as a prisoner. 6 months later, on May 30, 1942, I-16 achieved what had eluded her at Pearl Harbor, a successful midget submarine attack. Operating in the Indian Ocean against British forces at Diego Suarez, Madagascar, I-16 launched another midget submarine commanded by Ensign Iwase Katsusuke. This midget submarine successfully penetrated the British anchorage and fired its torpedoes, scoring a hit on the British battleship HMS Ramillies that caused severe damage. The 29,150-ton battleship, a veteran of World War I, took on 1,800 tons of water and was nearly lost. Though Ramillies survived thanks to excellent damage control and would go on to bombard German positions during D-Day, the attack demonstrated I-16's capability for launching devastating surprise attacks. The midget submarine also sank the tanker British Loyalty before being lost with its crew. This success at Madagascar represented the high watermark of Japanese midget submarine operations, proving the concept could work under the right circumstances, but also highlighting the extreme danger and typically one-way nature of such missions. During the Guadalcanal campaign, I-16 conducted multiple resupply runs to isolated Japanese garrisons and launched additional midget submarine attacks. The submarine had become part of the Tokyo Express, the desperate effort to supply Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands by submarine after surface ships could no longer safely make the journey. On November 28, 1942, she launched midget HA-10, which successfully torpedoed the American cargo ship USS Alchiba, forcing her to beach herself to avoid sinking. Alchiba, loaded with aviation fuel and ammunition, burned for days but was eventually salvaged. I-16 subsequently covered the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in early 1943 and continued supply runs to bypassed garrisons in New Guinea. She had survived an air attack in December 1943 that caused light damage, but her luck was about to run out. The supply missions that I-16 and her sisters undertook represented the deteriorating Japanese strategic position. Once proud fleet submarines were reduced to carrying rice and medical supplies to starving garrisons on bypassed islands. Each mission meant running a gauntlet of American aircraft and warships for the dubious reward of delivering a few tons of supplies to troops who were ultimately doomed. It was a terrible waste of scarce submarines and trained crews, but the Japanese Navy's code of honor demanded that no garrison be abandoned while any means of supply remained. On May 14, 1944, I-16 departed Truk Lagoon under the command of Lieutenant Commander Takeuchi Yoshitaka, carrying a cargo of rice in 75-pound rubber bags intended for the starving Japanese garrison at Buin on Bougainville. The garrison there had been bypassed by American forces and was slowly being starved into submission, making supply runs by submarine their only lifeline. The 40,000 Japanese troops on Bougainville had been cut off since November 1943, and conditions had become desperate. Men were dying of starvation and disease daily, and incidents of cannibalism had been reported. But I-16's departure transmission, intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, had sealed her fate. The 3 American destroyer escorts were already converging on her predicted position. On the afternoon of May 19, 1944, an Allied reconnaissance aircraft, a consolidated PBY Catalina from a Navy patrol squadron, spotted I-16 on the surface north of Bougainville, confirming the intelligence that had brought the hunter-killer group to these waters. The submarine was running on the surface to recharge her batteries and make better speed toward her destination. Japanese submarines of this period suffered from relatively weak batteries and slow underwater speeds, forcing them to spend considerable time on the surface where they were vulnerable to aircraft and radar-equipped warships. The 3 destroyer escorts immediately formed a line abreast and commenced a coordinated sonar sweep of the area. This formation, with ships spaced at optimal sonar detection intervals, created an acoustic net that few submarines could escape. At 13:35 hours, England's sonar operator, a young sailor from Iowa who had never seen the ocean before joining the Navy, reported contact with a submerged submarine. The distinctive ping of the sonar return indicated a solid object at a range of 1,350 yards. The hunt was on. I-16 immediately commenced the standard Japanese submarine evasion tactics: radical changes in depth and direction, sudden speed changes, and sharp turns designed to throw off the attacking ship's targeting solution. These tactics had been developed through hard experience and had saved many submarines from destruction. Japanese submarine commanders were trained to think three-dimensionally, using depth as well as course changes to evade attackers. Lieutenant Commander Takeuchi was fighting for his life and the lives of his 106 crew members. Lieutenant Commander Pendleton brought England in for her first attack run. The approach required precise coordination between the sonar operators tracking the submarine, the plotting team calculating the target's course and speed, and the Hedgehog crew preparing their weapon. But the first Hedgehog salvo missed as I-16 successfully evaded, diving deep and turning sharply at the last moment. The second attack also failed to connect. I-16 was using every trick in the book, releasing bubbles to create false sonar targets, changing depth rapidly to throw off range calculations, and making radical course changes that pushed the submarine's hull to its structural limits. On the third attack, England's Hedgehog scored a single hit, but the big submarine's strong hull absorbed the damage, and she continued her desperate evasion maneuvers. The explosion would have been devastating inside the submarine, the concussion throwing men against bulkheads, shattering light bulbs and potentially causing flooding. But I-16's crew managed to maintain control and continue evading. Japanese damage control training was excellent, and submarine crews were drilled relentlessly in dealing with battle damage. Pendleton, demonstrating remarkable persistence and tactical skill, set up for a fourth attack, which again missed the violently manoeuvring submarine. By now, the hunt had been going on for over an hour. The tension aboard England was palpable. The crew knew they had a submarine trapped but couldn't deliver the killing blow. In the plotting room, officers worked frantically to predict I-16's next move. The sonar operators strained to maintain contact as the submarine dove deeper, approaching the thermal layers where temperature differences in the water could hide it from sonar. But on the fifth attack run, England's Hedgehog crew had learned from their previous attempts. They had noticed patterns in RO-16's evasion tactics, a tendency to turn to port when diving, a preference for certain depth bands. At 14:35 hours, multiple projectiles found their mark, and the ocean erupted. The massive underwater explosion that followed was so powerful it lifted England's stern completely out of the water, throwing men to the deck and rattling the entire ship. The explosion was heard and felt on the other destroyer escorts thousands of yards away. 20 minutes later, oil and debris began rising to the surface. Rice bags, pieces of wood, cork insulation, and other unmistakable evidence that I-16 had been destroyed. Among the debris were personal effects, a sailor's cap, pages from a Japanese book, a wooden sandal, poignant reminders of the human cost of war. The submarine that had launched the first attack at Pearl Harbor was gone, taking all 107 officers and men, including Lieutenant Commander Takeuchi, to their deaths. They had died in the service of a lost cause, carrying rice to a garrison that would surrender anyway when the war ended. Meanwhile, the 7 submarines of the NA line had departed Saipan around May 17, 1944, to take up their assigned positions. The departure had been marked by a ceremony attended by Vice Admiral Takagi himself, who exhorted the submarine commanders to do their duty for the Emperor. Each captain received a ceremonial cup of sake and a white headband inscribed with patriotic slogans. They knew the odds against their survival were high. American anti-submarine capabilities had improved dramatically since the war's early days. All 7 were RO-class boats, Type RO-100 submarines that were much smaller than I-16. Originally designed for coastal defence, these 760-ton boats were armed with 4 torpedo tubes in the bow, carrying 8 torpedoes total, plus a 76mm deck gun. The design reflected pre-war Japanese naval thinking that emphasized quality over quantity, resulting in submarines that were well built but too few in number and lacking the mass production advantages that made American submarines so effective. Most were equipped with Type 22 radar detectors, but lacked radar themselves, making them poorly suited for the reconnaissance mission they had been assigned. Their job was to spot American carrier forces and report their movements, but without radar, they would have to spend dangerous amounts of time on the surface using visual lookouts. Of the 20 Type RO-100 submarines Japan would build during the war, not a single one would survive to see the surrender. The first submarine of the NA line to meet its fate was RO-106. This submarine had already compiled a notable war record. On July 18, 1943, during operations in the Solomon Islands, RO-106 had torpedoed the American tank landing ship LST-342 in Blanche Channel near New Georgia. The torpedo detonated the LST's ammunition stores, causing a catastrophic explosion that blew the ship in half. The stern section sank immediately, while the forward section remained afloat long enough to be towed to shore. Among the 121 men killed were the ship's entire mess division of African-American stewards and cooks, as well as the renowned artist Lieutenant Commander McClelland Barclay, who had created many of the war's most famous recruiting posters before volunteering for combat duty. RO-106 had survived serious damage from airdropped depth charges in October 1943 and returned to service after repairs. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 22, 1944, at 0350 hours, George's radar operator detected a surface contact that proved to be RO-106. The submarine was running on the surface, recharging batteries under the cover of darkness, a necessary but dangerous operation that left submarines vulnerable to radar-equipped enemies. George illuminated the submarine with a 24-inch searchlight, catching her completely by surprise. Her E-27 radar detector had failed to function, leaving her blind to the approaching destroyer escort. The powerful beam of light would have been blinding to the submarine's bridge watch, who had been using night vision to scan for enemies. Despite the surprise, RO-106's crew reacted quickly, crash diving beneath the surface before George could bring her guns to bear. The submarine's officer of the deck ordered an emergency dive, and within seconds the bridge was cleared and the submarine was heading under. The dive took less than 40 seconds, well within Japanese Navy standards, but it wasn't fast enough to completely escape. George launched a hedgehog attack at 04:15, but missed the frantically evading submarine. At 04:25, England gained sonar contact on RO-106 as she attempted to escape. The submarine was making turns for 8 knots, zigzagging violently while changing depth. England's first hedgehog attack missed, but then the submarine made what may have been a fatal tactical error. RO-106 reversed course and turned bow on to England, possibly attempting to fire torpedoes at her attacker. This manoeuvre, however, presented a perfect target for the hedgehog. Not understanding how the new weapon system worked, that it fired ahead rather than being dropped over the stern, the submarine commander had inadvertently positioned his boat directly in the hedgehog's kill zone. England's second attack scored at least 3 direct hits. The explosions would have been catastrophic inside the submarine. The hull breached in multiple places, water rushing in at tremendous pressure, electrical systems shorting out in showers of sparks. The submarine broke up immediately, her pressure hull collapsing as she plunged toward the ocean floor. RO-106 was lost with all 49 hands. The entire action, from first radar contact to the submarine's destruction, had taken just 36 minutes. The next day brought another success. RO-104, under the command of Lieutenant Hisashi Izubuchi, had spent most of her previous patrols in the frigid waters of the North Pacific and Aleutian Islands, a stark contrast to the tropical waters where she now hunted. The North Pacific had been a secondary theatre for Japanese submarines, used mainly for reconnaissance and occasional attacks on the supply line between the United States and the Soviet Union. During operations in the Solomons in late 1943, RO-104 had performed a remarkable rescue mission on November 3, 1943, saving 75 survivors of the Japanese light cruiser Sendai after she was sunk in a night surface action with American cruisers during the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. The rescue had been performed under dangerous conditions, with American aircraft patrolling overhead and the constant threat of discovery by American warships. Among those rescued was Rear Admiral Baron Matsuji Ijuen, commander of Japanese destroyer Squadron 3, whose survival was considered vital to the Imperial Navy. On May 23, 1944, at 0604 hours, an Allied aircraft spotted RO-104 on the surface approximately 250 nautical miles north-northwest of Kavieng, New Ireland. This time the submarine's radar detector worked, giving just enough warning for an emergency dive. The submarine's lookouts spotted the aircraft at almost the same moment the radar detector alarm sounded, and she quickly submerged before the destroyer escorts could close to gun range. Once submerged, RO-104's captain employed every evasion technique he knew. Raby made the first attack run, but RO-104 had learned from the fate of her sisters. In addition to violent evasive maneuvers, the submarine employed a sophisticated countermeasure, transmitting bursts of tuned sound impulses designed to jam Raby's sonar. This technique, known as acoustic deception, had been developed by Japanese submariners as a last-ditch defense against sonar-guided attacks. The tactic worked. Raby made 4 hedgehog attacks over the course of 2 hours, all of which missed. George then took over the attack, with her crew determined to succeed where Raby had failed. The destroyer escort made 5 hedgehog runs against the elusive submarine. Despite the crew's best efforts and increasingly accurate attacks, all 5 salvos missed as RO-104 twisted and turned beneath the waves. The submarine's captain was fighting for his crew's lives with skill and determination, but he was only delaying the inevitable. Each evasion maneuver consumed precious battery power, and the submarine's air was growing foul with carbon dioxide as the life support systems struggled to keep up. Finally, at 0819, England moved in for her turn. The first Hedgehog attack missed, but England's sonar team had been carefully observing RO-104's evasion patterns for over 2 hours. They noticed that the submarine tended to turn to starboard while diving, preferred depths between 200 and 250 feet, and accelerated just before making major course changes. On the second attack, England's team had precisely calculated RO-104's next move. Between 10 and 12 projectiles found their mark, and the resulting underwater explosion was followed by the unmistakable sounds of a submarine breaking up, the screech of tearing metal, the thunder of imploding compartments, and then silence. It wasn't until 10:45 that debris finally reached the surface, confirming that RO-104 and all 58 hands had been lost. The debris field was extensive: wooden decking, cork insulation, clothing, and the oil slick that had become the signature of a submarine's grave. Among the debris was a life ring with Japanese characters, providing definitive proof of the kill. The deadly efficiency of the hunter-killer group was becoming apparent. In just 4 days, they had sunk 3 Japanese submarines, but the hunt was far from over. The very next day, May 24th, brought another contact and another kill. RO-116 was relatively new, on only her second war patrol under the command of Lieutenant Commander Shibuya Kunio. The submarine had been commissioned just 6 months earlier, and her crew was still gaining experience. Many were recent graduates of the submarine school at Kure, young men who had joined the Navy filled with dreams of glory, but were now facing the harsh reality of a war Japan was losing. At 1200 hours, George gained radar contact at the remarkable range of 17,000 yards, nearly 10 miles, approximately 225 nautical miles north-northwest of Kavieng. This exceptional detection range was due to ideal atmospheric conditions that enhanced radar propagation. RO-116 dove immediately, but her crash dive was slower than it should have been, a sign of her crew's relative inexperience. At 15:00, George gained sonar contact at just 750 yards. The submarine employed the same desperate tactics as her predecessors: violent rudder shifts, radical depth changes, and sophisticated sonar jamming. These tactics proved temporarily successful, frustrating George's attacks. The destroyer escort made multiple runs, but each time RO-116 managed to evade at the last moment. England moved in and made 2 aborted Hedgehog runs when the targeting solution fell apart at the last moment. The submarine was fighting hard, but her crew's inexperience was beginning to show. Their evasion patterns were becoming predictable, and they were slow to respond to the attacking ship's manoeuvres. But on the third attempt, England's crew had RO-116's number. At 0214, at least 3 projectiles struck home. The submarine's destruction was swift but oddly quiet. There were none of the massive secondary explosions that had marked previous kills. This suggested that RO-116's torpedoes had not detonated, possibly because the hits were in areas away from the torpedo room, or because safety procedures had prevented sympathetic detonations. RO-116 simply broke apart and sank, taking all 56 hands with her into the depths. 2 days later, on May 26th, the hunter-killer group found RO-108, commanded by Lieutenant Obari Kenichi. This submarine had already proven herself dangerous to American forces. On October 3, 1943, RO-108 had fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at 3 American destroyers that presented an overlapping target in Huon Gulf off New Guinea. It had been a textbook attack. RO-108 had detected the destroyers by their sonar pinging, manoeuvred into perfect position, and fired a spread that gave maximum probability of hits. USS Smith detected the torpedo wakes and successfully evaded, her captain ordering emergency speed and full rudder to comb the wakes. But USS Henley was not so fortunate. 2 torpedoes struck her port side amidships in the No. 1 fire room, breaking the destroyer's keel. The hits were devastating. The explosion ruptured fuel tanks, started massive flooding, and broke the ship's back. Henley broke in too and sank rapidly, killing 15 men and wounding 52 others. Smith and USS Reed counter-attacked, but RO-108 escaped, diving deep and running silent, while the Americans dropped depth charges in her wake. Later, on December 17, 1943, RO-108 was caught on the surface by a PBY Catalina flying boat while recharging her batteries. The aircraft's attack with depth charges caused serious damage, and the submarine went down by the stern, taking on water through damaged hull plates. But somehow her crew managed to save her through heroic damage control efforts, working in flooded compartments to shore up bulkheads and patch leaks. She returned to service after months of repairs at Truk. At 23:03 hours on May 26th, Raby gained radar contact on RO-108 at 15,000 yards, approximately 110 nautical miles northeast of Seidler Harbour at Manus Island. England also gained radar contact before the submarine Dove. Once submerged, England gained sonar contact at 1,650 yards. The submarine was making maximum submerged speed, trying to open the range before the destroyer escorts could attack. Raby was vectored in for the first attack, but her Hedgehog salvo missed. The submarine had turned inside Raby's attack run, a manoeuvre that required precise timing and steady nerves. At 23:23, England commenced her attack run. This time there would be no prolonged hunt. England's Hedgehog scored between 4 and 6 hits on the first salvo. The multiple explosions would have torn RO-108 apart instantly. The submarine's hull, already weakened by her previous battle damage, couldn't withstand the multiple direct hits. RO-108 went down with all 53 hands. By now, Japanese naval intelligence was becoming alarmed. On May 27, 1944, the Japanese Sixth Fleet intercepted and decoded American naval communications, indicating several submarines had been sunk north of the Admiralty Islands. The American reports were described by Japanese intelligence as increasingly jubilant in tone. The Japanese Radio Intelligence Service, though not as successful as its American counterpart, was still capable of intercepting and partially reading American communications. Warning messages were immediately transmitted to the remaining submarines of the NA line. The messages were sent on multiple frequencies and repeated several times to ensure reception. RO-112 received the warning and immediately cleared the area. She would survive only to be sunk by USS Batfish off Luzon on February 11, 1945, with the loss of all 61 hands. RO-109 also received the warning and escaped the killing zone, though she too was living on borrowed time. She would be sunk by the destroyer transport USS Horace Base off Okinawa on May 7, 1945, with all hands lost. But RO-105, under the command of Lieutenant Junichi Inoue, either never received the warning or, for reasons that will never be known, chose to remain at her assigned position. Perhaps her radio was damaged, or perhaps her captain felt duty-bound to maintain his station regardless of the danger. The submarine had sortied from Saipan on May 14, 1944, with the commander of Japanese Submarine Division 51, Captain Ryanosuke Kato, embarked, adding even more pressure to remain on station. The presence of a division commander aboard would have made it virtually impossible for Lieutenant Inoue to abandon his patrol area without explicit orders. During previous patrols, RO-105 had several close calls. On August 12, 1943, she had narrowly avoided 2 torpedoes fired by USS Tarpon in a stern shot through violent evasive action. The American submarine had achieved perfect firing position, but RO-105's lookouts had spotted the torpedo wakes just in time. In September 1943, she had fired torpedoes at the light cruiser USS Columbia, but missed when the cruiser detected the torpedoes and evaded. She had also rescued several downed Japanese aviators at various times, earning the gratitude of the Naval Air Service. These rescues were dangerous operations, requiring the submarine to surface in daylight near enemy-controlled territory. After sinking RO-108, the 3 destroyer escorts had to replenish their heavily depleted stocks of Hedgehog projectiles. They proceeded to Seidler Harbour at Manus in the Admiralty Islands, where they quickly loaded ammunition and supplies. The replenishment was done with urgency. Everyone knew there were still enemy submarines out there, and every hour spent in port was an hour the submarines could use to escape or attack American forces. Upon departing, they joined a larger hunter-killer task group that had arrived in the area, centered on the escort carrier USS Hoggett Bay, and including the destroyers USS Hazelwood, USS Heermann, USS Hole, and USS McCord, plus the destroyer escort USS Spangler. The arrival of the carrier group added air power to the hunt, with Hoggett Bay's aircraft able to search vast areas of ocean and vector surface ships to submarine contacts. During the night of May 30th to 31st, Hazelwood gained radar contact on what would prove to be RO-105. The submarine immediately dove and commenced evasive maneuvers that would continue for the next several hours in one of the most prolonged submarine hunts of the war. RO-105's captain pulled every trick in the book in his desperate fight for survival. The submarine discharged debris to create false sonar targets, released oil slicks to simulate damage, and executed maneuvers so violent that they pushed the boat's hull to its structural limits. The hunt continued through the night, with multiple ships taking turns attacking. Hazelwood gained sonar contact and dropped conventional depth charges, the explosions sending geysers of water high into the air, but without apparent effect on the submarine. The depth charges were set for various depths, trying to bracket the submarine, but RO-105 managed to avoid lethal damage. George made several Hedgehog attacks and may have scored 3 hits with 1 salvo, yet incredibly, the submarine continued manoeuvring and fighting. The hits would have caused damage and casualties aboard RO-105, but her crew managed to maintain watertight integrity and continue evading. Japanese submarines were strongly built, with multiple watertight compartments that could allow them to survive significant damage. As dawn broke on May 31st, Spangler and England joined the attack. The sunrise revealed a calm sea with an oil slick marking where the submarine had been hit, but RO-105 was still fighting. Spangler's Hedgehog attack missed when the submarine made a radical turn at the last moment. At this point, Commander Haynes, still aboard George, transmitted a message that would become part of naval legend. "Oh hell, go ahead, England." It was both an acknowledgement of England's superior success rate and the expression of frustration at the submarine's stubborn refusal to die. England's crew, who had been watching their sister ships attack without success, were eager for their chance. England's attack was devastating. Her crew had been observing RO-105's evasion patterns all night and had noticed subtle patterns, a slight hesitation before major turns, a preference for certain depth bands when under attack. At 0736, the Hedgehog salvo triggered a massive underwater explosion that dwarfed even the spectacular destruction of I-16. Between 6 and 10 projectiles found their mark, and the resulting detonations were followed by secondary explosions as RO-105's own torpedoes detonated. The violence of the explosion was extraordinary. A column of water shot hundreds of feet into the air, and the shock wave could be felt through the hulls of ships miles away. RO-105 was literally blown apart, with Captain Cato and all 55 hands killed instantly. The oil slick that rose to the surface spread for miles, mixed with debris that included recognizable pieces of the submarine's hull, wooden decking, and personal effects of the crew. It was a grim reminder of the totality of destruction that modern naval warfare could inflict. In just 12 days, from May 19th to May 31st, 1944, USS England had sunk 6 Japanese submarines, a feat unparalleled in the history of anti-submarine warfare. The achievement was all the more remarkable considering that England was not a powerful destroyer, but a modest destroyer escort, and that she was just 5 months out of the shipyard on her first war patrol. The statistics spoke for themselves. Of the 7 submarines assigned to the NA line, 6 had been destroyed, with 5 of them falling to England's Hedgehog. Only RO-109 had escaped, and she would meet her fate less than a year later off Okinawa. The impact of England's success rippled far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Upon learning of the achievement, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest J. King sent a message that carried the weight of a promise. There'll always be an England in the United States Navy. The message was both a recognition of the ship's unprecedented achievement and a tribute to Ensign John C. England, whose heroic sacrifice at Pearl Harbor had inspired the crew. The crew of England was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, one of only 3 destroyer escort crews in World War II to receive this honor. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism in action against enemy Japanese submarines in the Pacific War area from May 19th to 31st, 1944, the USS England's brilliant performance in this vital mission contributed materially to the successful operations of our forces and upheld the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service." Lieutenant Commander Pendleton received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the submarine killing spree, though many historians have noted that his executive officer, Lieutenant John A. Williamson, deserved equal credit for the ship's remarkable tactical proficiency. Williamson had been the one conducting endless drills, refining attack procedures, and maintaining the crew's edge during long months of routine patrols. His contribution to England's success would be recognised when he later assumed command of the ship. The strategic implications were even more significant than the Navy leadership initially realised. The loss of the NA line submarines initially convinced Japanese naval commanders that a large American force had passed through the area en route to the Western Carolines or Western New Guinea, rather than the actual target, the Mariana Islands. This misinterpretation caused Admiral Toyoda to delay and misdirect the execution of Operation Ago. Japanese fleet units wasted precious fuel moving to the wrong positions, and by the time they realized their error and repositioned to defend the Marianas, it was too late. The American invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944, catching the Japanese fleet out of position. The resulting Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought on June 19 to 20, 1944, saw the destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. In what American pilots called the Marianas Turkey Shoot, over 400 Japanese aircraft were shot down against minimal American losses. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk, and the myth of Japanese naval aviation superiority was permanently shattered. The loss of the Marianas also brought American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, sealing Japan's fate. Although the US Navy attempted to keep England's success secret to protect the source of the intelligence that had made it possible, Japanese naval intelligence correctly deduced that the loss of the submarines was due to American radio intelligence. Internal Japanese reports acknowledged that their codes had been compromised, yet incredibly, they persisted in believing that their main naval codes remained secure. This denial would cost them dearly in the remaining year of the war, as American codebreakers continued to read Japanese messages and direct American forces to intercept Japanese ships and submarines. The story of USS England ultimately transcends its specific historical moment to become something universal, a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and determination in the face of mortal danger. It reminds us that in the darkest hours of conflict, when nations clash and the fate of millions hangs in the balance, ordinary people can rise to meet extraordinary challenges and, in doing so, write their names indelibly in the annals of history. The crew of USS England did exactly that in May 1944, and their achievement will be remembered as long as naval history is studied and tales of courage at sea are told. The sea on a winter's night has a way of muting the world. Above the surface, the half-moon hung pale in the sky, spreading a thin trail of silver across the Pacific swells. Each crest rose and fell with a rhythm that seemed eternal, indifferent to the great war raging across continents. There was no sound but the wind over the water, and even that came in whispers. To any sailor standing watch on the deck of a Japanese destroyer that night, it might have seemed peaceful, almost deceptively so. But beneath that shimmering skin of the ocean, a predator was waiting. The submarine was USS Archerfish, a Buckley-class boat of the United States Navy. She was 311 feet of welded steel, painted in dull grey, her conning tower just a shadow against the moonlit sea when she surfaced, her periscope and radar antenna barely breaking the horizon when she submerged. Inside her pressure hull, the air was close and heavy, tinged with oil, sweat, and machinery. Men moved quietly around valves, gauges, and plotting tables, their voices hushed, their concentration absolute. They had been at war for years now, and yet in this moment something felt different. Something monumental was unfolding. At the centre of it stood Commander Joseph F. Enright, a 33-year-old officer with dark eyes and a reputation that had been, until recently, uncertain. He had tasted failure before. On an earlier command, he had hesitated at crucial moments and returned from patrol without firing a single torpedo. To a submariner in wartime, such a patrol was more than disappointing. It was shameful. Enright had even requested to be relieved, feeling that his instincts had failed him. He carried that scar into every decision he made now. Tonight, in these black waters south of Honshu, he intended to redeem himself. Enright stood at the periscope, one hand resting lightly on the grip, the other fingering a rosary in his pocket. He was Catholic, and while not outwardly pious, he found comfort in that string of beads when responsibility weighed on him. And responsibility was heavy tonight. Somewhere to the north, beyond the headlands of Tokyo Bay, an enormous Japanese vessel was moving. The radar operator had called it out first, just a blip, 12 miles away, steady on a southwest course. The contact was large, unmistakably so, and Enright knew in his bones that this was no ordinary freighter. The question was, what was it? The Archerfish had been assigned to lifeguard duty earlier in the evening, waiting to rescue downed American airmen from raids that never launched. Now, free to roam, she had stumbled across a prize, though no one aboard yet knew its true magnitude. Enright's thoughts turned to the great Japanese battleships, the Yamato and Musashi, behemoths that had shaken the seas. Musashi had been sunk at Leyte Gulf just weeks earlier, hammered by waves of American bombers. Could Yamato herself be coming out? Or was this something even stranger, something new? The submarine shuddered slightly as she adjusted course. In the control room, men bent over the plotting board, tracing the lines of relative motion, adjusting bearings with grease pencils. They worked with quiet urgency, knowing that timing and geometry meant life or death. A mistake here would not only lose the target, but could invite destruction from the destroyers that certainly screened her. For now, though, Archerfish kept her distance, shadowing on the surface, using the darkness and the thin edge of cloud to hide her silhouette. Inside the submarine, life was tense but disciplined. The crew had long since learned to live in tight quarters. Torpedo men slept alongside their weapons in the forward room, officers shared bunks in shifts, and every man knew his station by instinct. The air carried a constant hum, fans, pumps, the low murmur of the diesels when surfaced. Men wore sweat-stained khakis, some stripped to undershirts in the muggy compartments. On nights like this, nerves heightened every sound, the creak of the hull as the sea pressed in, the slap of waves against the bow, the faint buzz of the radar screen. Each sound was magnified by expectation. And Enright was not about to let expectation become hesitation again. He had resolved that months earlier when he sat across a poker table at Midway Naval Base. A senior officer had studied his aggressive bluffing and asked him, "Joe, would you command a submarine the way you play cards?" His answer had been simple, yes, That answer had bought him another chance. Now, at the periscope, that chance was about to be tested. What Enright could not know yet was the scale of what lay before him. The ship he was stalking was Shinano, the pride of Japanese shipyards, and at 71,890 tons fully loaded, she was the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. She had been completed in secrecy, commissioned only days earlier, and sent into the night with skeleton training and unfinished systems. She was supposed to be a symbol of strength, of defiance. Instead, she was steaming unknowingly toward a single submarine, commanded by a man who needed redemption as badly as the Japanese Navy needed a miracle. The moon slipped briefly behind a veil of clouds, darkening the horizon. In that moment, the men aboard Archerfish felt the ocean grow even quieter, as though holding its breath. Enright leaned into the eyepiece once more. The silhouette was faint, but there, it loomed. He saw the escorts, darker smudges cutting through the water around the main vessel. A destroyer turned sharply, racing toward them, and for an instant it seemed the hunter had become the hunted. Then, inexplicably, the destroyer sheared off, wheeled back, and resumed station alongside its charge. The chance remained. Enright whispered to his officers, calm but firm. "Stay with her. Let her zig. We'll find where she straightens out." His words carried not just orders, but a promise, to himself, to his men, to his career. He would not hesitate this time. He would trust his instincts. He would strike. The clock ticked toward midnight. Somewhere ahead, the largest warship in history moved through the night, unaware that beneath the calm sea, a submarine and her determined captain had locked her in their sights. The stage was set. The game of patience, geometry, and fate had begun. The year was 1944, and the tide of the Second World War had turned with a force that was now undeniable. For Japan, the empire that had once stretched from the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Burma, the war was no longer about expansion. It was about survival. The empire stood on the defensive, battered from the air, strangled at sea, and bleeding in its outer island fortresses. The Pacific was no longer a vast moat protecting the Japanese home islands. It had become a battlefield that shrank with each passing month. American forces had leapt from island to island in a relentless advance. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and then the Marianas. Each step brought US forces closer to Japan's heart. With every landing, the Japanese military was forced to fight from a weaker position, stretched thin, with resources dwindling and morale sinking. By the summer of 1944, the Philippines campaign had begun. General Douglas MacArthur, true to his famous promise, had returned. His troops were battling their way through Leyte and beyond, while Admiral Chester Nimitz directed the great fleets of the US Pacific Navy in a steady march toward Okinawa. The oceans themselves had become hostile to Japanese shipping. Once the Imperial Navy had dominated those waters, but now it was American submarines that ruled beneath the waves. These silent service boats were proving devastatingly effective. Submarines like Archerfish had cut Japan's merchant fleet to ribbons. Tankers carrying oil from the East Indies were going down faster than they could be replaced. Cargo ships bringing food, weapons, and raw materials were easy prey for submarines armed with patience and torpedoes. By 1944, Japan had lost more than half its merchant fleet, and the shortage was becoming crippling. Factories slowed, fuel ran short, and even basic supplies grew scarce. The mathematics of war had turned brutally against Japan. Where once the empire could replace losses in ships and aircraft, now each vessel sunk was irreplaceable. The great shipyards that had produced the fleet which struck Pearl Harbor were now struggling to patch damaged vessels, let alone build new ones. Steel was scarce, skilled workers had been drafted into the military, and American bombing raids were beginning to target industrial centers. Above the waves, the situation was no better. The US Navy had assembled the most powerful carrier strike groups ever seen. The fast carriers of the 3rd and 5th Fleets ranged freely across the Pacific, their aircraft pounding Japanese bases and striking the home islands themselves. The skies were no longer safe. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, with its immense range, had begun daylight bombing runs against Japan's cities. Tokyo and Nagoya burned under their firestorms, and more raids were coming. The Imperial Navy, once the most modern and feared force in the Pacific, was now a pale reflection of its former glory. Its air arm had been decimated at Midway in 1942. Its battleships had been bloodied in the Solomons and the Marianas, and at the Great Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Japan had thrown everything it had left into one last gamble. The result was disaster. Carriers like Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, were sunk. The mighty battleship Musashi was destroyed under the relentless waves of American bombs and torpedoes. And though Yamato, the largest battleship afloat, had survived the encounter, she had been damaged and forced to retreat. The human cost was equally devastating. Japan's experienced pilots, the ones who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with such precision, were nearly all dead. Their replacements were hastily trained, often with less than 50 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. American pilots, by contrast, arrived at the front with hundreds of hours of training. The result was slaughter in the skies. Japanese aircraft were being shot down at ratios of 10-1, sometimes worse. Japan was running out of time, running out of ships, and running out of options. Yet even in this desperate situation, the nation clung to one last hope: that a powerful new weapon could shift the balance, if only for a time. That weapon was not another battleship or a new aircraft design. It was a ship unlike any the world had seen, a carrier so massive, so heavily armoured and so secret that the Allies had no confirmation it even existed. Her name was Shinano, after the old Japanese province. Born from the hull of a Yamato-class battleship, she was meant to be untouchable, a fortress at sea. Japanese planners believed that if this carrier could be completed and put into action, she might anchor their defensive line around the home islands. Perhaps she could carry enough aircraft and special attack weapons to blunt the American advance, maybe even to threaten the invasion fleets that were surely coming. The strategic thinking behind Shinano reflected Japan's evolving doctrine. No longer could the Imperial Navy dream of decisive battles where superior training and equipment would prevail. Instead, they needed a ship that could survive American air attacks, serve as a floating base for aircraft repair, and deliver the new suicide weapons that were becoming central to Japanese strategy. The Oka rocket-powered kamikaze planes and Shinyo explosive motorboats represented a grim calculation that Japanese lives could be traded for American ships at favourable ratios. But even as Japan built her, the realities of war pressed in. Shipyard workers toiled in shifts that stretched 16 hours or more. Materials were scarce, quality slipped, and deadlines loomed. The Shinano's completion was rushed, so rushed that vital safety tests were skipped. The Empire needed the ship, and it needed her now. In Tokyo, leaders clung to illusions. If Shinano could steam with a full air group, she might bring down swarms of B-29s. If she could sail to the Philippines, she might disrupt MacArthur's landings. If she could simply appear off Okinawa or Formosa, her mere presence might shake American confidence. The war was slipping away, but perhaps, just perhaps, one great ship could slow the inevitable. Yet desperation is no substitute for strength. Japan was already resorting to measures that betrayed how dire the situation had become. The kamikaze corps was not a sign of strength but of weakness, an admission that conventional warfare was no longer possible. Young pilots, some barely out of their teens, were being told that their highest service to the Emperor was to die ramming their aircraft into American ships. It was a strategy born of despair, dressed in the language of honour. The seas around Japan were no longer friendly. American submarines hunted the coasts relentlessly. Wolf packs of 3 or 4 boats would coordinate attacks on convoys, sinking escorts and merchantmen alike. In late November, as Shinano prepared to leave her shipyard, dozens of submarines lurked in the approaches to Tokyo Bay. They had divided the waters into patrol zones, each boat responsible for its sector, all reporting contacts to coordinate interceptions. Most would never know she existed, but one would, and that single encounter would decide her fate. The broader strategic picture was clear to any objective observer. Japan had lost the war. The only questions remaining were how long the fighting would continue and how many would die before the end. But for those caught in the machinery of war, the sailors, the shipbuilders, the pilots, such clarity was impossible. They continued to fight, to build, to hope, because the alternative was unthinkable. By November 1944, Japan was an empire under siege, its seas patrolled by unseen predators, its skies burned by firebombs, its cities trembling under the certainty of invasion. Into that storm sailed Shinano, a colossal ship, unready, untested, and carrying the burden of a nation's last hopes. And waiting for her, unseen in the night, was a submarine commanded by a man seeking redemption. Every great warship begins as a drawing on paper, lines on a blueprint that promise steel, power, and prestige. The story of Shinano began in just that way, but her destiny would change more than once before she ever touched salt water. She was conceived in 1940, at the height of Japanese naval ambition, as the third of the Yamato-class battleships. These were to be the largest, heaviest, most heavily armed battleships ever built, designed to outmatch anything afloat in the American or British fleets. Their armour was thicker, their guns larger, their displacement greater. They were symbols of an empire that sought dominance of the seas. The Yamato-class represented a philosophy of naval warfare that dated back decades. Japanese strategic thinkers, aware that their nation could never match American industrial capacity, believed in qualitative superiority. If Japan could not build more ships than America, it would build better ships. Each Yamato-class battleship would be worth 2 or 3 of its American counterparts. Their 18.1-inch guns could strike targets at ranges where enemy vessels could not respond. Their armour could shrug off shells that would cripple lesser ships. 2 of her sisters were completed to that original design, Yamato and Musashi, each mounting 9 immense guns capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds farther, and with more destructive power than any naval artillery before them. These shells could penetrate 16 inches of armour at ranges exceeding 25 miles. Shinano's keel was laid down at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, one of the Empire's great shipyards, with every expectation that she would follow them into the Pacific as a floating fortress. The construction began with ceremony and pride. Shinto priests blessed the ground where she would rise. The emperor himself was informed of the project. The finest steel was allocated, the most experienced shipbuilders assigned. In the original plans, she would displace 72,000 tons fully loaded, mount the same massive guns as her sisters, and cruise at 27 knots despite her enormous bulk. She represented not just a weapon, but a statement of Japanese technical prowess. But wars have a way of reshaping dreams. In June 1942, Japan suffered a devastating loss at the Battle of Midway. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost in a single day. Along with them went hundreds of experienced pilots and the backbone of Japan's naval air arm. That battle shifted the balance of power in the Pacific permanently. No longer could Japan rely on its carriers to project power as it had in the early triumphs of 1941 and 1942. The loss at Midway forced a fundamental reassessment of naval strategy. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, had proven to be the decisive weapons of modern naval warfare. The age of the big gun was ending. The age of the aircraft had arrived. The Navy's planners looked at Shinano's massive hull, still incomplete in her dock, and faced a choice. To finish her as a battleship meant to produce another gun platform in an era when carriers determined the outcome of war, To leave her unfinished was unthinkable. Too much had already been invested. The answer was clear. Shinano would be converted into an aircraft carrier. Not just any carrier, but the largest carrier the world had ever seen. The conversion was radical and complex. The lower hull, already shaped for a battleship's needs, had to be adapted for entirely different purposes. Her armoured citadel, originally designed to withstand enormous shell fire, was reconfigured to support an expansive hangar deck. Where gun turrets would have stood, aircraft elevators were installed. The superstructure was redesigned, shifted to starboard in the style of carriers. A flight deck, 840 feet long and 130 feet wide, was constructed above everything else. Unlike other carriers, she would not be built primarily to launch vast offensive strikes. Instead, she was envisioned as a support carrier, a mobile fortress that could protect fleets with her armour, repair aircraft in battle, and carry suicide planes and motorboats designed for special attack missions. Her hangar could accommodate 47 aircraft, with storage for another 70 in crates that could be assembled as needed. She would serve as a floating reserve, replenishing the air groups of other carriers that had suffered losses. This concept reflected the changing Japanese strategy. By 1944, Japan could no longer count on massing hundreds of trained pilots for conventional battles. The experienced aviators who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack were mostly dead. Their replacements were inadequately trained, often with less than 50 hours of flight time. Instead of conventional air power, Japan sought weapons of shock and desperation. Shinano would become their arsenal. The secrecy surrounding her construction was unprecedented. Fearing American bombers would destroy the ship before she ever sailed, the Navy took extraordinary measures. The dry dock where Shinano was being built was enclosed under a massive concrete roof, shielding her from prying eyes in the sky. This roof, supported by enormous steel girders, turned the construction site into a vast covered workshop. The workmen who toiled on her hull were confined within the yard. They lived in barracks on site, forbidden to leave or communicate with the outside world. They were threatened with prison, or worse, if they revealed a word of what they were building. Military police patrolled the perimeter. Not a single photograph of Shinano under construction was allowed to leave the yard. Even within the Imperial Navy, knowledge of Shinano was tightly controlled. Only a select few officers were permitted to know her specifications, documents referring to her used code names. When she finally emerged, she would be a surprise not just to the Americans, but even to some of her own countrymen. This level of secrecy created its own problems. Suppliers delivering materials often didn't know what they were contributing to. Coordination between different departments suffered. Mistakes that might have been caught through normal oversight went unnoticed. Her design pushed the limits of naval engineering. With a full load displacement of 71,890 tons, Shinano dwarfed every other carrier afloat. Her armoured flight deck, a rarity among carriers, could resist 1,000-pound bombs. Her armoured belt, up to 8 inches thick at the waterline, gave her a level of protection unknown in carrier design. Her hangar was divided by heavy armour intersections, intended to prevent a single bomb or torpedo from crippling the entire ship. Her engines, 4 steam turbines producing 150,000 shaft horsepower, were designed to drive her at speeds of 27 knots despite her massive bulk. The defensive armament was formidable, 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns in 8 twin mounts, capable of engaging both surface and air targets. Over 125mm anti-aircraft guns were distributed across her hull, creating overlapping fields of fire. 12 28-barrel rocket launchers could fire salvos of explosive shells skyward, creating a curtain of steel against attacking aircraft. In theory, she would be nearly impossible for aircraft to approach, let alone successfully attack. Yet for all this grandeur, Shinano was being born into crisis. The workers building her were no longer the skilled craftsmen who had constructed Yamato and Musashi. Many experienced shipbuilders had been drafted into military service. Their replacements were conscripts, students, even prisoners of war. Quality control, once the pride of Japanese shipbuilding, deteriorated. Welds that should have been X-rayed for flaws were merely visually inspected. Tolerances that should have been measured in millimetres grew to centimetres. The pressure to complete her was relentless. Tokyo demanded she be ready by November 1944. Work continued around the clock. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were carried away, replaced immediately by others. The heat inside the covered dock in summer was stifling. In winter, workers' hands grew numb from cold. Accidents increased. Men fell from scaffolding, were crushed by moving steel plates, or were overcome by fumes from welding. Each death was hushed up, the war effort deemed more important than individual lives. Materials, too, were compromised. The special steel allocated for her armour was sometimes diverted to other urgent projects. Inferior substitutes were used. Electrical wiring, much of it imported before the war, was now irreplaceable. When supplies ran out, improvised solutions were implemented. Systems that should have been redundant became single points of failure. The great ship was being held together as much by determination as by engineering. Despite these challenges, she took shape. Month by month, her hull rose higher. Her flight deck stretched toward completion. Her island superstructure grew from the starboard side. To those who saw her, even incomplete, she was awesome. Workers would pause in their labour to simply stare at the immensity of what they were building. She was not just a ship, she was a floating city, a monument to human ambition. On the morning of October 8, 1944, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal stood braced for a moment of triumph. After 4 years of secret construction, Japan's greatest shipbuilding gamble was to touch the water for the first time. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. This was to be more than a launch. It was to be a symbol of Japanese resilience, proof that even under bombardment and blockade, the empire could still create wonders. The day began with elaborate ceremony. At dawn, Shinto priests in white robes arrived to conduct purification rites. They waved streaming wands of white paper, chanted ancient prayers, and sprinkled salt to purify the ground. An altar was erected near the bow, offerings of rice, fish, and sake placed before it. The priests called upon the kami, the spirits of water, wind, and steel, to protect the vessel and grant her victory. High-ranking naval officers arrived in dress uniforms, their chests heavy with medals. Representatives from the imperial household were present. Workers, exhausted from years of labour, were given new clothes for the occasion. They stood in neat ranks, pride momentarily overcoming fatigue. Bands played martial music. Flags flew from every available point. The concrete roof that had hidden Shinano for so long had been partially removed, allowing shafts of sunlight to illuminate her hull. The launch plan was precise. Dry dock number 6 would be slowly flooded through controlled valves. As the water rose, Shinano would lift from her building blocks and float free. She would then be guided by tugs to a fitting-out pier where her final equipment would be installed. It was a procedure the shipyard had performed hundreds of times. What could go wrong? At 10:30 a.m. the order was given to begin flooding. Workers turned the valve wheels, and seawater began to flow into the dock. At first, everything proceeded normally. The water rose steadily, inch by inch, creeping up Shinano's hull. Spectators watched expectantly. Then, without warning, catastrophe struck. The caisson gate sealing dry dock number 6 from Tokyo Bay collapsed. The massive steel barrier, designed to hold back the ocean, failed under the crushing pressure. Instead of a controlled flooding, a torrent of seawater burst inward with unstoppable force. The sound was like thunder, a roaring cascade that drowned out all other noise. In seconds, millions of gallons of water surged into the dock. Shinano, instead of rising gently, was hit by a wall of water. The massive ship surged forward like a cork blasted from a bottle, her 70,000 tons of steel driven by hydraulic force. She slammed into the dock's far wall with a grinding crash that shook the earth. The impact sent tremors through the shipyard. Windows shattered a quarter-mile away. Mooring cables, thick as a man's arm, snapped like threads. The recoil sent them whipping through the air with lethal force. One cable decapitated a worker, another crushed 3 men against a crane. The great hull rebounded from the impact and swung sideways, her stern smashing into the dock's side wall. She seesawed back and forth, a massive pendulum of destruction, crushing everything in her path. For long minutes, chaos reigned absolute. Workers fled in panic, some diving into the churning water to escape the swinging hull. Others were swept away by the torrent. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar. The carefully choreographed ceremony had become a disaster. The band's instruments were scattered, flags torn away, the Shinto altar smashed to splinters. When the water finally stabilized and Shinano came to rest, the damage was surveyed. Miraculously, despite the violence, no fundamental structural damage had occurred to the ship herself. Her hull bore dents and scrapes, twisted fittings and broken railings, but her integrity remained. The human cost was another matter. 17 workers were dead, 43 injured. Some bodies were never recovered, swept out to sea or crushed beyond recognition. But perhaps the greatest damage was psychological. To the Japanese workers and sailors, ships were not mere machines. They possessed spirits, souls that needed to be properly honoured. A ship whose launch was marked by disaster was considered cursed by the kami. The violent, uncontrolled launch was the worst possible omen. Word spread quickly through Yokosuka, then beyond. Whispers followed wherever Shinano's name was mentioned. She killed men before she even touched the sea. The ocean itself tried to reject her. The kami have turned their faces away. Captain Toshio Abe, newly appointed to command Shinano, tried to suppress such talk. A stern, practical officer who had survived Midway, he had no patience for superstition. In a speech to the crew, he dismissed the accident as meaningless. "Steel and engines have no spirit," he declared. "Discipline and training win battles, not omens." But even as he spoke, he could see doubt in his men's eyes. Sailors are superstitious by nature, and Japanese sailors especially so. Many made private offerings at shrines, seeking protection against the curse they believed clung to their ship. The repairs from the launch disaster were rushed, as everything about Shinano had become rushed. New plates were welded over damaged areas. Bent fittings were hammered straight or replaced. Paint covered the scars. Within 3 weeks, external evidence of the catastrophe had been erased, but those who had witnessed it could not forget. The image of that massive hull slamming back and forth, the screams of crushed workers, the sense that something fundamental had gone wrong, these memories persisted. Work resumed at an even more frantic pace. The November deadline loomed, and the accident had cost precious time. Safety procedures, already compromised, were further reduced. The watertight doors that should have been tested under pressure were merely checked to see if they closed. Electrical systems that should have been thoroughly inspected were given cursory reviews. The assumption seemed to be that if Shinano looked complete, she was complete. The crew assigned to her reflected this haste. Normally, a carrier's complement would train together for months before deployment. They would drill until every man knew not just his own job, but could fill in for others. Damage control, the art of saving a wounded ship, required particular expertise. Teams needed to work in perfect coordination, sealing compartments, manning pumps, fighting fires, all while potentially in darkness with the ship listing. But Shinano's crew was assembled from wherever men could be found. Veterans from sunken ships, new recruits fresh from training, workers conscripted from civilian life, they were thrown together with minimal organization. Many didn't even speak the same dialect of Japanese. The officers tried to conduct drills, but time was too short, the crew too green. When they practiced damage control procedures, confusion reigned. Men got lost in the maze of passages. Equipment was in the wrong places. Orders were misunderstood. Among the crew, talk of the curse persisted. Petty officers reported that men were requesting transfers, claiming illness, even injuring themselves to avoid sailing on Shinano. The ship's chaplain, a Buddhist priest, conducted blessing after blessing, trying to calm fears. But each ceremony seemed to emphasize the problem rather than solve it. Why did the ship need so many blessings if nothing was wrong? November arrived with urgency. The deadline was no longer approaching. It had arrived. Ready or not, Shinano had to sail. The American submarine threat grew worse each day. Intelligence reported dozens of enemy boats operating in Japanese waters. B-29 bombers were ranging farther from their bases in the Marianas. It was only a matter of time before they discovered and destroyed Shinano at her dock. The final weeks of preparation took on a desperate quality. Equipment that should have been carefully installed was literally thrown aboard. Crates of supplies were stacked wherever space could be found. The special weapons she was to carry, 50 Oka suicide rocket planes and several Shinyo explosive motorboats, were loaded into her hangars. These weapons, themselves symbols of Japan's desperation, seemed appropriate cargo for a desperate ship. On November 11, 1944, Shinano was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was subdued compared to the attempted grandeur of her launch. No bands played. Few dignitaries attended. Captain Abe read the official orders in a flat voice. The rising sun flag was raised on her mast. She was now officially a warship, though hardly a ready one. The commissioning revealed just how incomplete she was. Of her 12 boilers, only 8 were operational. This reduced her maximum speed from the designed 27 knots to about 20 knots. Her radar systems were only partially functional. Half of her anti-aircraft guns lacked adequate ammunition. The aircraft elevators that would lift planes from hangar to flight deck had never been tested under load. Most critically, many of her watertight doors, the barriers that could seal off flooded compartments, had never been tested under pressure. Captain Abe compiled a list of deficiencies that ran to 17 pages. He submitted it to Naval Headquarters with a request to delay sailing until at least critical repairs could be completed. The response was swift and uncompromising. Shinano would sail as scheduled. The naval staff's reasoning was political as much as military. Word of the supercarrier's existence was spreading. She needed to be revealed as a symbol of strength, not discovered as a bombed wreck. The sailing orders were specific. Shinano would depart Yokosuka on the night of November 28th, steam south along the coast, and reach Kure Naval Base in the Inland Sea. There, protected from submarines by narrow straits and from bombers by distance, she would complete her fitting out. The voyage would take only about 20 hours. What could go wrong in 20 hours? The crew prepared with a mixture of pride and dread. They were sailing on the world's largest warship, a technological marvel. Yet they were also sailing on an unfinished ship with an untrained crew, many of whom believed her cursed. Last letters were written home. Personal effects were stowed. Some men visited Shinto shrines, leaving offerings and prayers. Others got drunk on sake, trying to drown their fears. The escort for the voyage was minimal, just 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze. All 3 were veterans of numerous battles, their crews experienced but their ships worn. Their radar and sonar systems, damaged in previous engagements, had been only partially repaired. They would have to rely more on lookouts than instruments. For protecting the world's largest carrier, it seemed inadequate. But every available destroyer was needed elsewhere. The night of November 28, 1944, began with deceptive calm. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, the massive form of Shinano prepared for departure. Steam built in her boilers. Navigation lights flickered to life. On her bridge, Captain Abe reviewed the charts one final time. The route was straightforward, south along the coast, around the Izu Peninsula, then west to Kure. They would travel at night to avoid American bombers and stay close to shore to minimize exposure to submarines. At 6 p.m., Shinano's mooring lines were cast off. Tugs nudged her massive bulk away from the pier. Her screws began to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering power. The great ship moved under her own power for the first time. Despite everything, the rushed construction, the cursed launch, the incomplete systems, she was magnificent. Her hull stretched nearly 900 feet. Her flight deck rose 60 feet above the water. She displaced more than most harbours could handle. She was, by any measure, an engineering triumph. The three destroyers took up their screening positions, Isokaze in the lead, Yukikaze and Hamikaze on the flanks. Together, the four ships headed for the harbour entrance and the open sea beyond. As they passed through the submarine nets protecting the harbour, several crew members noticed what they took as another bad omen: a dead albatross floating in the water, its white wings spread like a surrender flag. What none aboard knew was that 30 miles to the south, USS Archerfish was beginning her patrol. The submarine had been on lifeguard duty, positioned to rescue American airmen from a bombing raid that had been cancelled due to weather. Now, free to hunt, Commander Enright had brought his boat to the surface to recharge batteries and refresh the air. The night was perfect for submarine operations, dark enough to hide their low silhouette, calm enough for good sound conditions, with just enough moon to spot targets. At 8:48 p.m., Archerfish's radar operator called out, "Contact! Bearing 020, range 12 miles. The blip on the radar screen was large, steady, and moving southwest at about 20 knots. Enright rushed to the bridge, raising his binoculars. On the horizon, barely visible, he could make out a dark mass and the smaller shapes of escorts. His pulse quickened. This was no merchant vessel. The size, the speed, the escorts, everything suggested a major warship. "Battle stations," Enright ordered quietly. Throughout the submarine, men moved to their positions with practiced efficiency. In the forward torpedo room, crews checked their weapons. In the control room, plotting teams prepared their charts and calculating boards. The hunt was on. Enright faced an immediate problem. The target was moving at 20 knots. Archerfish's maximum surface speed was 19 knots. In theory, the submarine couldn't catch her prey. But Enright knew that Japanese ships often zigzag to avoid submarines, and those course changes would slow their advance. If he could anticipate the pattern, cut corners, he might be able to close the distance. For the next hour, Archerfish pursued at maximum speed, her 4 diesel engines straining. The submarine vibrated with the effort, her hull cutting through the swells, spray breaking over her bow. Below, engineers coaxed every possible revolution from the engines. The temperature in the engine room soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men worked in shifts, rushing topside to gulp fresh air before returning to their stations. On Shinano's bridge, radar operators detected the American submarine almost immediately. The equipment might have been partially functional, but it worked well enough to spot a surface contact at several miles. Captain Abe received the report with grim satisfaction. He had expected submarines. The waters off Japan were infested with them, but he had plans to deal with this threat. "Signal the escorts," he ordered. "Enemy submarine bearing 170, distance 8,000 meters." Abe's tactical situation was complex. His ship, despite her size, was vulnerable. She carried no aircraft to spot submarines. Her own sonar was not yet operational. She depended entirely on her escorts for protection, and he knew their capabilities were limited. The destroyer's sonar had been damaged in previous battles and repaired with inferior components. Their depth charge racks were only partially filled. Supplies were short everywhere. Moreover, Abe faced a dilemma. If he ordered the destroyers to pursue the submarine, they would have to leave Shinano's side, potentially exposing her to other submarines that might be lurking. American wolf packs often operated with one boat revealing itself to draw off escorts while others moved in for the kill. But if he kept the destroyers close, the trailing submarine could shadow them, radioing their position to other boats or aircraft. Abe chose what seemed the prudent course. He would keep his escorts close and use speed and evasive maneuvers to shake off pursuit. "Execute zigzag pattern number 7, he ordered. The helm swung over, and Shinano's massive bulk began a series of course changes: 45 degrees to port, steady for 10 minutes, 60 degrees to starboard, steady for 8 minutes, back to base course for 15 minutes, then repeat. The zigzag was a standard anti-submarine tactic, but it had drawbacks. Each turn cost speed and distance. What should have been a 20-hour voyage would now take longer. Fuel consumption increased, and most critically, the pattern could be analysed and predicted by an experienced submarine commander, which is exactly what Enright was doing. In Archerfish's control room, the plotting team tracked each of Shinano's course changes. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bobczynski, the executive officer, bent over the chart table, measuring angles and times. "She's following a standard pattern," he reported. "If we cut across her turns, we can gain distance." It became a deadly game of geometry. Shinano would turn away, opening the distance. Archerfish would cut the corner, closing it again. The submarine couldn't match the carrier's straight-line speed, but by taking shorter routes, she could keep pace. It required precise calculation and iron nerve. One miscalculation, and they would lose contact. One detection by the destroyers, and they would face a barrage of depth charges. As the chase continued into the night, Shinano's incomplete construction began to tell. At 11 p.m., a bearing on the starboard inboard propeller shaft began to overheat. The massive shaft, turning at high speed, generated friction that the bearing couldn't properly dissipate. Temperature gauges climbed into the red zone. The engineering officer faced a terrible choice: continue running and risk catastrophic failure, or slow down and perhaps fall prey to the submarine. He chose to reduce speed on that shaft. Shinano's speed dropped from 20 knots to 18. The reduction seemed small, but it was critical. Now Archerfish could not just keep pace, but actually gain ground. On the submarine, the sonar operator reported the change in the target's engine sound. "She's slowing," he announced. Enright permitted himself a tight smile. The geometry of the hunt had shifted in his favour. But Shinano's troubles were just beginning. The rapid zigzagging, combined with her incomplete construction, stressed systems throughout the ship. Electrical connections, hastily installed, began to fail. Lights flickered in some compartments. Ventilation fans stopped. The temperature in the lower decks, already uncomfortable, became stifling. Men working in the engine rooms had to be rotated every 20 minutes to prevent heat exhaustion. More seriously, the constant course changes caused the ship to roll and flex in ways her incomplete structure wasn't prepared for. Seams that had been inadequately welded began to work open. Not enough to cause immediate flooding, but enough to allow seepage. Water began to accumulate in some of the lower compartments. Pumps were started to deal with it, but several pumps failed. They had never been properly tested, and now, under actual use, their defects became apparent. On the bridge, Captain Abe received report after report of mechanical issues. Each one was minor in itself, but collectively they painted a picture of a ship coming apart under stress. He faced an agonizing decision. He could slow further, nursing his ship to port but making her an easier target. Or he could maintain speed and risk more serious breakdowns. He chose a middle course, reducing speed to 16 knots and moderating the zigzag pattern. By 2 a.m. on November 29th, the deadly dance had continued for over 5 hours. Archerfish had closed to within 7,000 yards of her target, still too far for a torpedo attack, but close enough to maintain solid contact. The submarine's crew was exhausted but exhilarated. They could sense they were gaining on their prey. Enright studied the tracking data with intense concentration. Shinano's pattern was becoming clear. Despite the zigzags, she consistently returned to a base course of 210 degrees, southwest toward Kure. If he could position Archerfish ahead of that track, if he could predict when she would steady on that course, he would have his shot. "Take her down to radar depth," he ordered. The submarine slipped beneath the surface, leaving only her radar antenna above water. This reduced her speed but made her much harder to spot. Now she was truly a hunter in the darkness, invisible but watching. On Shinano, the mood was increasingly tense. The submarine had been trailing them for hours. Why hadn't it attacked? Why hadn't it been driven off? Some officers suggested it was calling in other boats, that they were being herded into a trap. Captain Abe dismissed such speculation, but privately he wondered. American submarine tactics had evolved throughout the war. They were more aggressive now, more coordinated. At 2:56 a.m., fate intervened. Isokaze, the lead destroyer, spotted what her lookouts believed was a periscope off the starboard bow. Without waiting for orders, her captain increased speed and charged toward the contact. The destroyer's bow wave rose white in the darkness as she accelerated to 35 knots. On Archerfish, the sonar operator's voice rose in alarm. "High-speed screws approaching." Destroyer bearing 340, closing fast. Enright had seconds to decide. Crash dive and probably lose his target forever, or hold his depth and risk detection. He chose to dive, but only to 150 feet, shallow enough to resurface quickly. "Rig for silent running," he ordered. "Rig for depth charge." The destroyer passed directly overhead, her screws thundering through the water. Every man on Archerfish held his breath, waiting for the splash of depth charges. But none came. Isokaze had lost contact and, more importantly, had violated Captain Abe's orders to maintain formation. A sharp signal from Shinano's bridge ordered her back into position. The moment Isokaze turned away, Enright brought Archerfish back to periscope depth. Shinano was still there, still on course, now only 4,000 yards away. The opportunity he had waited for all night was at hand. At 3:15 a.m., everything aligned. Shinano steadied on her base course of 210 degrees. She was broadside to Archerfish, range 1,400 yards, speed 16 knots. In submarine warfare, it was the perfect setup, close enough for accuracy, angled for maximum target area, slow enough for a good solution. Enright made his final observations through the periscope. The carrier filled his view, massive beyond anything he had ever seen. Her flight deck stretched like a cliff face. Her island structure rose like a building. He could see lights in some of her portholes, the shadows of her escorts, the white water at her bow. He sketched quickly, recording her strange rounded bow, unlike any carrier in the recognition manuals. "Final bearing and shoot," he ordered. "Make ready all tubes." In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes were ready. These weapons had been troublesome earlier in the war, with defective detonators and running depths. But the problems had been fixed. Now they were reliable ship killers, each carrying 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. "Set depth 10 feet, Enright ordered. It was unusually shallow, but he remembered advice from a senior officer. Against carriers, hit high on the hull where the damage would affect stability, not just cause flooding. The fire control party made their final calculations. Target speed, angle, distance, all were fed into the torpedo data computer, an analog device that calculated the correct firing angle. The solution was checked and double-checked. There would be no second chance. "Fire one!" The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo left its tube. A blast of compressed air ejected the weapon, which immediately came to life, its propellers spinning, driving it toward the target at 46 knots. "Fire two!" 8 seconds between shots, giving each torpedo time to clear before the next launched. "Fire 3, Fire 4, Fire 5, Fire 6. In less than a minute, 6 death sentences were racing through the water toward Shinano. The torpedoes ran hot, straight and normal, exactly as designed. Their wakes, barely visible in the darkness, drew straight lines toward the carrier's hull. On Shinano's bridge, lookouts spotted the wakes too late. "Torpedoes starboard!" came the cry. Captain Abe ordered full rudder, but the carrier's massive bulk responded slowly. She had barely begun her turn when the first torpedo struck. The explosion was tremendous. A column of water shot up alongside the hull, higher than the flight deck. The ship lurched to port from the impact. Before the crew could react, the second torpedo hit, then the third, then the fourth. 4 hits in less than 30 seconds, all on the starboard side, all between the bow and the island structure. The first torpedo struck at frame 104, near an aviation fuel tank that was fortunately empty. The explosion tore a hole 20 feet wide in the hull, flooding adjacent compartments instantly. The second hit frame 142, destroying the starboard outboard engine room. Men on duty there were killed instantly as seawater and superheated steam filled the space. The third torpedo struck frame 166, opening the number 3 fire room to the sea. The fourth hit frame 190, rupturing another fuel tank and sending oil flooding through passages. For a moment, those on Shinano's bridge could barely comprehend what had happened. The ship shuddered with each impact, but she was so large that the torpedoes seemed almost insignificant. Captain Abe's first thought was that she could absorb this damage. After all, she had been built with a battleship's armour, designed to survive multiple torpedo hits. But below decks, catastrophe was unfolding. The incomplete construction that had plagued Shinano now became fatal. Watertight doors that had never been tested failed immediately. Some jammed shut, trapping men in flooding compartments. Others refused to close at all. Seams that had been hastily welded split open under pressure. Electrical panels, soaked with seawater, short-circuited in showers of sparks. The damage control teams responded as best they could, but they were fighting a losing battle. The men had never drilled together as a unit. Orders were confused, contradictory. Some teams rushed to flood countervailing compartments on the port side to correct the list. Others tried to pump out flooded areas. The two efforts worked against each other. In the engine rooms, the situation was desperate. The starboard engine rooms were flooding rapidly. Engineers worked in rising water, trying to maintain power to the pumps. When water reached the electrical panels, explosions of sparks forced them to retreat. One by one, the starboard engines fell silent. The list increased steadily, 5 degrees, then 10, then 13. On the flight deck, aircraft and equipment began to slide. Sailors formed human chains, trying to secure loose items, but it was futile. A fuel truck broke free and crashed into the island structure. Boxes of ammunition tumbled into the sea. Captain Abe maintained rigid composure on the bridge. He ordered counter-flooding to correct the list. He set course for the nearest land, hoping to beach the ship. He dispatched messages to Naval headquarters. Shinano torpedoed. Position 32 degrees 00 north, 137 degrees 00 east. Attempting to reach shore. But even as he gave these orders, he must have known the truth. The reports from below were uniformly grim. Flooding was out of control. The pumps couldn't keep pace. Half the crew didn't know their damage control stations. The ship was dying. Back on Archerfish, Enright had taken the submarine deep immediately after firing. Now came the most dangerous moment for any submarine, the counterattack. Above them, Japanese destroyers were racing back and forth, their sonar pinging, their crews preparing depth charges. 400 feet, Enright ordered. Rig for silent running. The submarine descended into the darker waters, every man aboard silent, breathing shallowly. They could hear the destroyers above, the high-speed whine of screws, the ping of active sonar, the splash of depth charges entering the water. The first pattern exploded, 5 charges detonating in sequence. The submarine shook, light bulbs shattered, cork insulation rained from the overhead. But the explosions were distant, at least 500 yards away. The Japanese sonar, damaged and poorly maintained, couldn't get a precise fix on the submarine. More charges followed, 14 in total. Each explosion sent shock waves through the water, rattling the submarine, but none were close enough to cause serious damage. After an hour, the sounds above grew distant. The destroyers had given up the hunt and returned to their dying charge. When Enright finally brought Archerfish back to periscope depth at dawn, the horizon was empty. Whatever had happened to the giant carrier, she was gone. As dawn broke on November 29th, Shinano was in her death throes. The list had increased to 20 degrees. Walking on the tilted decks was becoming impossible. Men used ropes to pull themselves up the slanted surfaces. In the hangar deck, the Oka suicide planes had broken loose, sliding into each other, their volatile rocket fuel creating an extreme fire hazard. The flooding had spread far beyond the initial torpedo damage. This was the phenomenon naval architects called progressive flooding, water finding paths through doors, vents, cable runs, any opening, spreading like cancer through the ship. Compartments that should have been safe were filling. The weight of water, thousands of tons of it, was dragging Shinano deeper. Captain Abe made one last attempt to save his ship. He ordered all engines ahead full, trying to drive Shinano toward shore. But with only the port engines functioning, the ship could barely make 10 knots. She was travelling in circles, her rudder unable to compensate for the uneven thrust. At 08:30, Abe authorised the emergency signal. Prepare to abandon ship. It was not yet an order to abandon, but a warning to be ready. Sailors began gathering on the flight deck, helping wounded comrades up from below. Life jackets were distributed. The destroyers moved in closer, preparing to pick up survivors. Below decks, scenes of heroism and tragedy played out. Engineers remained at their posts, keeping the lights on and the pumps running until water drove them out. Medical officers worked in tilting sick bays, trying to evacuate patients. In one flooded compartment, 30 men were trapped behind a jammed hatch. Their hammering could be heard for an hour before it stopped. The end came quickly. At 10:18, the list suddenly increased to 35 degrees. Equipment, aircraft, and men began sliding uncontrollably down the flight deck into the sea. The order came: all hands abandon ship. But for many, it was too late. The list increased so rapidly that hundreds were trapped inside. Others, trying to climb the tilted deck, lost their grip and fell. Some jumped from the flight deck, a 60-foot drop that killed many on impact. Captain Abe remained on the bridge. As was tradition, he would go down with his ship. He tied himself to the helm, determined to maintain dignity to the end. Around him, his senior officers made the same choice. They sang the national anthem as the water rose around them. At 10:55, Shinano capsized. Her flight deck tilted past vertical, then she rolled completely over. For a moment, her massive hull was visible, barnacles and red anti-fouling paint gleaming in the morning sun. Then, with a tremendous roar of escaping air, she plunged beneath the surface. The largest warship in the world had survived just 17 hours at sea. The sea where Shinano sank was littered with debris and desperate men. Over 2,000 had been aboard. Now hundreds struggled in the oil-slicked water. The 3 destroyers moved among them, picking up survivors. But the rescue was selective. Naval tradition held that officers should be saved first. Some destroyer captains, hardened by war, refused to pick up men who showed panic. "Save only the brave," one captain told his crew. The result was tragedy upon tragedy. Men who had survived the sinking drowned within sight of rescue ships. Others, covered in oil, were too slippery to grab and slipped beneath the waves. The winter sea was cold. Hypothermia claimed those who weren't picked up quickly. When the rescue ended, 1,080 men had been saved. The remaining 1,435, including Captain Abe and most of his senior officers, were dead. It was one of the largest losses of life in a single ship sinking during the Pacific War. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic, but had to be hidden. Shinano had been a state secret. Her loss would remain one. Survivors were sworn to secrecy. Families of the dead were told only that their loved ones had died in action, not where or how. The official records were sealed. To the Japanese public, Shinano had never existed. But secrets are hard to keep in war. American codebreakers, reading intercepted messages, learned of the sinking within days. The name Shinano appeared in decoded traffic, along with her position when torpedoed. Intelligence officers were puzzled. They had no record of a ship by that name. What had Archerfish sunk? When Enright filed his patrol report in December, claiming to have sunk a carrier of unprecedented size, he was met with skepticism. Navy intelligence insisted no such carrier existed. The highest they would credit him with was a 28,000-ton carrier, still significant, but far short of reality. Only after the war, when American investigators gained access to Japanese records, was the truth revealed. Shinano had displaced 71,890 tons fully loaded. She was indeed the largest carrier ever built at that time, and remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Enright's instincts had been correct, his redemption complete. The story of Shinano's single voyage carries lessons that transcend the specific events of November 1944. It is a tale of hubris and humility, of grand ambitions undone by fundamental flaws, of how the smallest predator can fell the mightiest prey if conditions align. For Japan, Shinano represented the failure of the decisive weapon philosophy. Throughout the war, Japanese strategists had sought single war-winning weapons, super battleships, divine wind attacks, miraculous carriers. But wars are won by systems, not symbols. While Japan built one massive carrier, America built dozens of smaller ones. While Japan rushed incomplete ships to sea, America took time to train crews properly. The result was inevitable. The technical lessons were equally clear. Size without reliability is vulnerability. Armour without proper damage control is false security. A ship's strength lies not just in steel, but in the training of her crew, the quality of her construction, the integrity of every weld and seal. Shinano failed not because her design was flawed, but because her execution was incomplete. For the submarine force, the sinking validated their war of attrition. Submarines, relatively cheap and crewed by fewer than 100 men, could destroy capital ships worth thousands of times their cost. The silent service had proven it could strike anywhere, any time, against any target. The age of the submarine as a strategic weapon had truly arrived. Commander Enright's personal journey, from failure to redemption, resonated throughout the Navy. His story showed that one failure need not define a career, that persistence and courage could overcome past mistakes. He had faced his demons and emerged victorious. The Navy Cross he received was not just for sinking Shinano, but for the determination to stay in the fight after earlier defeats. The human cost haunts the story. Over 1,400 Japanese sailors died, many of them conscripts who had never wanted to go to war. They died trapped in flooding compartments, thrown from tilting decks, or abandoned in cold water. Their sacrifice achieved nothing. Shinano never launched a plane in anger, never defended the homeland, never justified the resources spent on her construction. Today, Shinano rests in 4,000 meters of water off Cape Omizaki. She lies upside down, her flight deck buried in sediment, her hull slowly collapsing under the pressure of depth and time. She is a tomb for the men who died with her, and a monument to the age when nations believed that bigger meant better, that one perfect weapon could change everything. Modern naval strategists study Shinano as a cautionary tale. In an age of nuclear carriers and ballistic missile submarines, the lessons remain relevant. Complexity requires competence. Size demands support. No ship, no matter how powerful, is stronger than the system that builds, maintains, and operates it. The sinking also demonstrates the role of chance in war. Had Shinano sailed a day earlier or later, had Archerfish been assigned elsewhere, had the torpedoes run deep instead of shallow, history would be different. War is not just strategy and technology, but also luck and timing. On that November night in 1944, all the variables aligned perfectly for Archerfish and catastrophically for Shinano. In the years after the war, the story of Shinano and Archerfish became legend in naval circles. Authors wrote books, historians analysed the engagement, veterans shared their memories. Each telling added details, corrected errors, built the narrative that we know today. Commander Enright went on to a successful naval career, retiring as a rear admiral. He rarely spoke publicly about the sinking, maintaining the quiet professionalism of the submarine service. When asked about that night, he would say simply, "We did our duty. The torpedoes worked. We were lucky." But those who knew him understood that it meant everything: the vindication of his courage, the proof that he belonged in command, the second chance that he had seized. The crew of Archerfish held reunions for decades. They would gather, these aging men who had once been young sailors, and remember their moment of glory. They told stories of the long chase, the tension of the approach, the thunder of the torpedoes hitting home. But they also remembered Shinano's crew, fellow sailors who had died doing their duty. War had made them enemies. Time made them all simply men who had served at sea. Some survivors of Shinano also told their stories after the veil of secrecy finally lifted. They spoke of the chaos, the fear, the sight of their mighty ship rolling over and sinking. They remembered Captain Abe's final moments, standing at attention as the water rose. They remembered comrades who had helped them escape flooding compartments, who had given up life jackets, who had pushed others to safety before being pulled under themselves. In Japan, Shinano became a symbol of the war's last phase, grand gestures that achieved nothing, magnificent failures that only added to the suffering. She represented the danger of believing one's own propaganda, of confusing appearance with reality, of rushing toward disaster rather than accepting defeat. For America, the sinking reinforced the democratic nature of naval warfare, that 80 men in a submarine could defeat thousands in a carrier, that patience and skill could overcome size and armour. It was David and Goliath written in steel and torpedoes, proof that in war, the smallest unit could achieve strategic victory. The wreck of Shinano was discovered in 2019 by deep-sea explorers. The images they brought back showed a ship remarkably intact despite decades underwater. Her hull, built to battleship standards, had resisted the pressure that would have crushed lesser vessels. But she lies inverted, her intended glory forever buried in the seafloor, a monument to ambition that exceeded capability. Today, as nations again compete to build the largest, most powerful warships, Shinano's story remains relevant. Technology advances, but the human factors that doomed her persist. Ships are still built in haste, crews still sail with insufficient training, leaders still believe that one supreme weapon can change everything. The ghost of Shinano warns against such hubris. The final lesson may be the most universal, that in war, as in life, the race does not always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Sometimes patience defeats power. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Sometimes a single night's action can echo through history, teaching generations yet unborn about courage, folly, and the thin margin between victory and disaster. On that November night in 1944, two ships met in the darkness of the Pacific. One was the largest of her kind ever built, the other a standard submarine of no special distinction. When the sun rose, only one remained. That is the nature of war at sea, sudden, decisive, and final. The ocean shows no favoritism to size or strength. It swallows all equally, keeping its secrets in the dark depths where Shinano rests still, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a giant felled by a predator she never truly saw.